4 tips when you must use direct flash. Now, what do I mean here? I mean that you're not using direct flash for stylistic purposes. You're using it simply because you need a light. I'm going to give you some tips here for when you have no other choice other than to use direct flash. And here is tip number 1. Don't use direct flash. Don't use it. In most situations, you honestly don't need direct flash. You can modify it, and we're going to show you tips and techniques. Even when you think you have no bounces, you think you have nothing to use, you do. You can use tons of things, and we're going to give you lots of small modifiers to help you to understand that even in a pinch, you don't have to use direct flash. You can bounce off something and get a much softer and much better look. But for that 1% of a time where honestly you have nothing with you that you can modify with, you have no other choice, you maybe have your onboard flash or you have a hot shoe flash, but you have no way to change anything. Well, here are some tips for you. The first shot was shot relatively bright, but you can see that her face is just a tiny bit in the shadows. This is just natural light with no flash. And I have a little check mark by it. Why did I say that this was okay? Because stylistically, that's totally fine as a look too. If you want to kind of expose to be brighter and you can brighten up a little bit for her skin and leave the background blown out, stylistically, that's totally okay if that's what you're going for. If you want light and airy, great, you got it. But what we definitely don't want to do is we don't want to go with this heavy flashed look, okay? So as soon as the ambient exposure, as soon as that background exposure starts to drop down and darken down and use direct flash to brighten them up significantly, you end up with this heavy flash look, and it looks terrible. It looks like a point and shoot. It just does not look good. So tip number 2 is to start by exposing the image for the desired level of ambient light. Brighter, the better, okay? So the brighter the background, the better, because it's gonna have a more natural look, a more natural feel to it. What we wanna do is when we have to use flash, we want it to be extremely subtle in these types of situations. This was heavy flash, this was medium flash. You can see that there's an improvement here. So the background has brightened up a little bit in this third shot, but not quite to the level of the first shot, but it is better than this heavy flash shot. But still, you can tell that there's quite a bit of flash being added here. This is what I would call medium flash, okay? So we brighten the background a bit, but it still is a little bit too dark and the flash is a little bit too high. So tip number 3 is to use the lowest flash power possible when you're using it to fill light or when you're using it even as a main light. Now the reason why I haven't put up camera settings here is because this applies regardless of whatever scene you're shooting in, whether it's daytime, whether it's nighttime, whether you're using it as a fill light, whether you're using it as a main light, you want that flash power to be very, very subtle. So for example, if I'm at night, remember that your flash has freezing capabilities, right? You don't need to worry about your shutter speed as much, okay? So what I would do at nighttime is slow the shutter speed down. I would slow it down to say 1/50th of a second, 1/30th of a second. As you start getting even slower, just make sure to turn on the rear curtain sync. So at 1/30th of a second, I would dial my ISO up to say 1600, shooting at f2.8. So I'm allowing a lot of ambient light in, and then I'm allowing the flash to shoot at a very low power setting. So that way our background is nice and bright and the flash power is very subtle. During the day, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm dialing it in so my background is very bright. I'm getting my exposure first, and this is why we always say use manual control for everything. Well, with the exception of this. When you're doing direct flash like this, it's actually okay to be using TTL because it's going to do a great job of exposing when you're just doing direct flash. So what I might do is just leave my ambient settings in manual, so I'll dial in everything manually from my shutter speed, my aperture, and my ISO. And on my camera, I might use just exposure compensation, my TTL compensation, and dial it down -1 or -2 to get to a lighter look. And what we end up with is with a super light fill flash. So tip number 4 is to soften that direct flash, if possible, with a bit of modification. Now what I mean is, if you've got a napkin, put a napkin in front of this, okay? If you've got a larger napkin, have someone hold the napkin off to the side and you can bounce from it. That's what I mean where we're gonna teach you ways that you can bounce and create a light regardless. But let's say you have nothing except for just a tiny little piece of cloth. If you put that in front, it will soften that flash just a little bit. So great, if you can soften up a little bit, fantastic. If not, then that super light fill flash is gonna create this look. And this was done with just a bare bulb, okay? So you guys can get an idea. So here we have that ambient exposure of roughly what we had in this first shot. Only here we're adding just a small kiss of fill flash. And what you can see is it brightens her up just a little bit, and it gives it a nice, it almost looks like we had a reflector to modify. You don't see any harsh flash shadows. It's just subtly brighter than the first shot. Now, why is this not the best type of technique? Well, particularly during the daytime like this, if I can't bounce, then I'd probably just use a reflector to modify, because this is so subtle anyway, a reflector would do the same thing. If I'm at nighttime, then most likely I can find something to bounce off, like I said, a napkin, a t-shirt, whatever you have, you can bounce off that. So if you're in a bind and you're in a pinch, you have your onboard direct flash, which can't be turned or modified, you can't change the direction of light, then this will work out. It'll give you at least a better direct flash shot. That being said, let's go on to the next videos. Let's start talking about all the different techniques that we can be using, starting with direct flash done right. Let's go to the next video now. The inverse square law. When we think of learning Flash, we think, oh my gosh, I gotta learn about all these ratios and inverse square law. And look, people make this thing out to be so much more complicated than it actually is, but it is important to understand. And I'm gonna explain to you the only piece of this that's important in layman's terms, or rather, pieman's terms, because I'm a layman and I appreciate when people explain things to me in layman's terms.